A peaceful afternoon in a public park takes a shocking turn when a young black man is harassed by a racist cop while simply watching TikTok. The officer, fueled by prejudice, accuses him without cause and escalates the situation with arrogance. But what the cop doesn't expect is that the young man's father is a high-ranking prosecutor, ready to expose the truth. A battle for justice unfolds, turning the officer's abuse of power into his own undoing. As the officer faces public shame and career-ending consequences, this story becomes a powerful example of standing up to injustice. It reveals the strength of community and resilience against systemic racism. Will the truth triumph? And can accountability truly make a difference? Watch the full story to find out. Don't forget to subscribe and like our channel for more impactful content. Marcus sat on the bench, his focus entirely on the screen of his phone. His thumb moved rhythmically, scrolling through TikTok videos, unaware of the approaching officers. Barnes' sharp eyes locked onto Marcus, his stride purposeful, his presence heavy with unspoken authority. Riley followed hesitantly, his mind racing as he tried to predict what Barnes intended to do. Marcus sat on the bench, his focus entirely on the screen of his phone. His thumb moved rhythmically, scrolling through TikTok videos, unaware of the approaching officers. Barnes' sharp eyes locked onto Marcus, his stride purposeful, his presence heavy with unspoken authority. Riley followed hesitantly, his mind racing as he tried to predict what Barnes intended to do. Marcus looked up, his expression shifting from calm to guarded as Barnes stopped in front of him. The officer's towering stance immediately signaled confrontation. Without preamble, Barnes demanded identification, his tone clipped and accusatory. Marcus' chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady as he complied, reaching for his wallet. His movements were slow, deliberate, aware of the potential for misinterpretation. Barnes took the ID, his eyes scanning it with exaggerated scrutiny. The silence between them grew oppressive. Marcus' breathing deepened, a subtle attempt to keep his nerves in check. When Barnes' gaze lifted, it carried a layer of suspicion that made Marcus' stomach churn. The officer questioned his presence, his tone laden with implications that Marcus instinctively recognized. Marcus explained himself, his words measured, his posture respectful. He kept his hands visible, his every action calculated to avoid escalation. But Barnes was unrelenting, his questions probing deeper, pushing past the bounds of reasonable inquiry. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, a mix of frustration and unease building in his chest. When Barnes demanded to see Marcus' phone, the tension cracked open. Marcus' jaw tightened, his grip on his phone firm. His voice remained calm, but there was an edge of defiance as he declined. The refusal lit a spark in Barnes' demeanor, his posture stiffening, his voice rising. Marcus stood, meeting Barnes' challenge with quiet strength, his heart pounding as he asserted his rights. Riley shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Barnes and Marcus. Doubt flickered in his expression, but he remained silent, his inexperience paralyzing him. Marcus noticed Riley's hesitation, a small glimmer of humanity in an otherwise oppressive situation, but he couldn't focus on it. His attention stayed on Barnes, whose presence seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The exchange escalated, Barnes stepping closer, his words sharper. Marcus held his ground, his hands steady at his sides, his voice unwavering. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the unspoken threat of what could happen if he faltered. The air between them was charged, the tension almost unbearable. Then, a commanding voice cut through the standoff, freezing both men in place. Marcus turned to see his father, James Hayes, striding toward them. James' expression was a mix of controlled anger and determination. His presence was electric, immediately shifting the dynamic. Barnes' confidence faltered, his posture losing its edge as James addressed him. James' words were precise, each one landing like a blow. Marcus felt a surge of relief but kept his composure, knowing the situation wasn't over. Barnes hesitated, his authority unraveling under James' unyielding gaze. Riley stepped back, his face flushed with discomfort, his inexperience glaringly obvious. As Barnes muttered a retreat, Marcus' body relaxed slightly, the adrenaline ebbing away. James turned to his son, his expression softening but still serious. Marcus met his father's eyes, a silent exchange of gratitude passing between them. The officer's departure left an uneasy quiet, the tension dissipating but leaving a heavy residue. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind replaying the encounter as he walked away with his father. His pulse slowed, but the weight of the moment lingered. James placed a hand on Marcus' shoulder, a gesture of reassurance. Marcus straightened his posture, the quiet resolve in his chest growing stronger. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a reminder of a larger fight, one he knew he couldn't avoid. Marcus' mind raced as he walked away from the confrontation with his father, his pulse still steady but his thoughts spinning. The encounter left a bitter taste, one that refused to fade despite James' calm reassurance. The tension had eased for the moment, but the looming presence of Officer Barnes lingered in Marcus' thoughts. He felt the weight of not just the incident but the greater narrative it fit into, one he could no longer ignore. Barnes' retreat had been anything but graceful. As he and Riley returned to their patrol car, Barnes slammed the door shut with a force that made the vehicle tremble. His jaw tightened, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. The burn of humiliation mixed with a seething anger that threatened to boil over. He had been challenged, not just by Marcus, but by James Hayes. The district attorney's intervention had left Barnes feeling cornered and powerless, a feeling he vowed to rectify. Riley sat silently in the passenger seat, the tension between them almost suffocating. He replayed the scene in his head, his discomfort growing with every passing moment. Marcus hadn't done anything to warrant such scrutiny, and Riley knew it. Yet, he had followed Barnes' lead, too inexperienced and too intimidated to speak out. The weight of his silence pressed heavily on him, but he couldn't find the words to address it with Barnes, whose simmering rage was palpable. Barnes broke the silence, his voice low and venomous. He muttered about disrespect, about how people like Marcus needed to be put in their place. His words were sharp and loaded, cutting through Riley's internal conflict like a blade. Riley shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the dashboard, unwilling to meet Barnes' eyes. The rookie's unease grew as Barnes' rant continued, his anger spiraling into dangerous territory. As Marcus and James approached their home, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. His father's calm demeanor was both reassuring and frustrating. James seemed composed, but Marcus knew better. Beneath the surface, his father's mind was already at work, analyzing every angle of the incident, calculating the next steps. Marcus wanted to believe that his father's influence would be enough to prevent further trouble, but a nagging doubt clung to him. Back at the precinct, Barnes stormed into the briefing room, his presence commanding immediate attention. The other officers glanced at him warily, sensing the storm brewing beneath his surface. Barnes wasted no time, launching into a tirade about respect and control. He painted Marcus as a troublemaker, twisting the narrative to justify his actions. His words dripped with bitterness, each one a carefully constructed weapon designed to rally support among his peers. Riley stood at the edge of the room, his heart pounding. He wanted to speak up, to challenge Barnes' version of events, but the rookie's fear of isolation held him back. He watched as some of the more seasoned officers nodded in agreement, their expressions hardening. Barnes' ability to manipulate the room was unnerving, and Riley felt his own silence becoming complicit. As the hours passed, the tension continued to build. Marcus tried to focus on his evening routine, but his thoughts kept circling back to the encounter. His phone buzzed with messages from friends who had seen the video of the confrontation circulating online. The jogger's recording had gone viral, sparking outrage and support in equal measure. Marcus felt a mix of vindication and dread. The exposure brought attention to the injustice, but it also painted a target on his back. Meanwhile, James' phone rang incessantly. Calls from colleagues, reporters, and community leaders flooded in, each one demanding his perspective on the incident. James handled each call with the precision of a seasoned prosecutor, his responses measured and deliberate. He knew the stakes were high, not just for Marcus but for the broader fight against systemic injustice. At the same time, Barnes' anger had crystallized into a dangerous resolve. He couldn't let the incident go unanswered. His pride demanded retribution, and he began to dig into Marcus' background, searching for anything he could use to discredit him. Barnes' obsession grew, consuming his thoughts and driving him further down a path of retaliation. Riley watched from the sidelines, his own internal conflict intensifying. He knew Barnes was crossing a line, but the rookie felt powerless to stop him. Late into the night, Marcus sat at his desk, his phone lighting up with notifications. Messages of support poured in, but so did threats and hateful comments. The duality of the internet's reaction weighed on him, each positive message a beacon of hope, each negative one a reminder of the hatred that still existed. Marcus felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest, his resolve tested by the onslaught of attention. James entered the room, his expression a mix of concern and determination. He placed a hand on Marcus' shoulder, offering a quiet reassurance. Marcus looked up, meeting his father's eyes. The unspoken bond between them strengthened, a shared understanding of the fight they were now entrenched in. Marcus took a deep breath, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't going to let Barnes or anyone else intimidate him into silence. At the precinct, Barnes pored over files, his frustration mounting as he struggled to find anything incriminating about Marcus. His obsession was palpable, his need for control driving him to reckless lengths. Riley watched from a distance, his unease growing. The rookie's conscience screamed at him to act, but his fear of the repercussions kept him frozen. He knew Barnes' vendetta was spiraling out of control, but he felt trapped, caught between loyalty to his partner and his own sense of justice. As dawn broke, Marcus prepared for a new day, his determination unwavering despite the challenges ahead. James had already left for a meeting with community leaders, his role as district attorney placing him at the forefront of the growing movement sparked by the viral video. Marcus knew the fight was far from over, but he felt a newfound strength in the support he had received. He was ready to face whatever came next, knowing he wasn't alone. Barnes arrived at the precinct earlier than usual, his mind restless after a sleepless night spent obsessing over Marcus Hayes. He couldn't let go of the feeling that Marcus' defiance and James Hayes' intervention had made him look weak. His pride refused to accept it. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as he sat at his desk, scrolling through Marcus' social media profiles. The viral video of their confrontation was all over the internet, and the comments ranged from supportive outrage to outright hostility, some directed at Marcus, others at Barnes himself. Each mocking comment about Barnes' behavior felt like salt in a wound. Riley watched Barnes from his desk, his own thoughts a tangle of doubt and guilt. The rookie officer couldn't shake the image of Marcus standing firm against Barnes. The tension from the day before still lingered in Riley's chest, and he knew Barnes was plotting something. The older officer's intense focus on his computer screen made Riley's stomach churn. Riley considered approaching Barnes, maybe trying to talk him down, but the fear of confrontation kept him rooted in place. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his room, staring at his phone. The support he had received online was overwhelming, but the hateful messages and threats stood out the most. They burned into his mind, each one a reminder that his fight for dignity had come at a cost. He opened a group chat with his closest friends and sent a message, asking them to meet up. He needed to clear his head, to be surrounded by people who understood him. At the same time, James was in his office, locked in a heated discussion with a group of community leaders. The viral video had sparked outrage, and calls for police accountability were louder than ever. James knew the weight of this moment. He had to navigate the fine line between seeking justice for his son and maintaining his professional integrity as the district attorney. His colleagues offered a mix of support and caution, urging him to tread carefully. Back at the precinct, Barnes finally found what he was looking for, an old police report involving Marcus. It was a minor incident from years ago, a misunderstanding that had been resolved without charges, but Barnes saw it as an opportunity. He printed the report, his lips curling into a satisfied smirk. This was all he needed to paint Marcus as a troublemaker, to shift the narrative in his favor. Barnes grabbed his jacket and stormed out, leaving Riley to watch in uneasy silence. Marcus met his friends at a local cafe, their familiar faces bringing a sense of comfort. They joked and talked about the video, offering both encouragement and frustration over the situation. Marcus tried to laugh along, but his mind kept wandering back to Barnes. He felt exposed, as if the officer's gaze was still on him, even now. One of his friends suggested going to the park to relax, and Marcus agreed, hoping the fresh air would help. Barnes wasn't headed to the park, but his destination was just as calculated. He parked outside Marcus High School, where he planned to speak with the principal about the old report. Barnes' strategy was clear: plant the seeds of doubt about Marcus' character wherever he could. The principal, however, was hesitant. She remembered Marcus as a bright and respectful student and didn't understand why Barnes was digging into the past. Their conversation ended on a tense note, with Barnes leaving frustrated but undeterred. Riley, back at the precinct, wrestled with his conscience. He couldn't sit by any longer. Gathering his courage, he approached their supervisor and expressed concerns about Barnes' behavior. The supervisor listened carefully but seemed reluctant to act, citing Barnes' years of service and reputation as a dedicated officer. Riley left the office feeling defeated, but his determination to do the right thing only grew stronger. At the park, Marcus and his friends sat on the grass, talking and enjoying the momentary peace. Marcus felt a flicker of normalcy, a brief respite from the chaos of the past day. But his phone buzzed relentlessly with notifications, pulling him back into reality. He finally silenced it, deciding to focus on the present. Barnes, now back in his car, made a call to a contact in the local media. He fed them the old police report, twisting the story to paint Marcus as a repeat troublemaker. The journalist on the other end hesitated but ultimately agreed to run the story. Barnes leaned back in his seat, satisfied that he was regaining control of the narrative. James' day took a sudden turn when his assistant informed him of the story about Marcus spreading online. Furious, he called the journalist to demand an explanation. The conversation was tense, with James accusing them of unethical reporting and threatening legal action. The journalist pushed back, citing their source as a trusted officer. James realized that Barnes was behind it, and his anger boiled over. He slammed the phone down and immediately began drafting a response. Marcus' peaceful afternoon was shattered when one of his friends showed him the article. His heart sank as he read the twisted version of events. The anger and frustration he had been holding back came flooding to the surface. His friends rallied around him, offering support, but Marcus felt the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. He knew he had to act, but he wasn't sure how. Back at the precinct, Riley overheard his colleagues discussing the article. The smug satisfaction in their voices made his blood boil. He confronted Barnes, accusing him of crossing the line. The confrontation was heated, with Barnes dismissing Riley as naive and inexperienced. Riley's hands trembled with anger, but he stood his ground, vowing to report Barnes' actions to internal affairs. Barnes' expression darkened, but he didn't respond, simply walking away. James called Marcus, his voice steady but firm. He assured his son that they would fight back, that the truth would come out. Marcus felt a surge of strength from his father's words. Together, they began planning their next move, determined not to let Barnes' lies go unanswered. The day ended with Marcus drafting a statement for social media, setting the record straight. His friends helped him refine it, their support unwavering. As he hit post, Marcus felt a mix of fear and resolve. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. Barnes' frustration turned to anger as he watched the online backlash against his narrative grow. The response to Marcus' statement was swift and overwhelmingly supportive. People flooded social media with comments and posts calling out Barnes' behavior, demanding accountability from the police department. Barnes felt cornered, and his mind raced for a way to regain control. He knew that if he let this spiral any further, it would damage his reputation beyond repair. At the precinct, tension simmered among the officers. Barnes' actions were now under scrutiny, and whispers about an internal investigation had started circulating. Riley watched as Barnes doubled down, ignoring the growing unease around him. Riley's resolve hardened. He had already taken the first step by reporting Barnes' behavior to internal affairs, but he knew it wasn't enough. The rookie officer's conscience wouldn't let him rest until justice was served. Meanwhile, Marcus' phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Messages of support poured in, but so did threats and hateful comments from those siding with Barnes. Marcus struggled to keep his emotions in check. The flood of negativity was exhausting, but his father's presence was a steadying force. James worked tirelessly, coordinating with legal advisors and community leaders to counter Barnes' smear campaign. Marcus felt a mix of gratitude and guilt, knowing how much his father was sacrificing to protect him. James arranged a press conference, determined to take control of the narrative. He stood at the podium, his voice firm and measured as he addressed the media. He laid out the facts, dismantling Barnes' false accusations and highlighting the systemic issues within the police department. The press conference was a turning point, shifting public opinion further in Marcus' favor. But James knew it wouldn't be enough to stop Barnes entirely. The officer's desperation made him unpredictable and dangerous. Barnes, seething with rage, decided to take matters into his own hands. He reached out to an old contact, a private investigator with a reputation for operating in moral gray areas. Barnes tasked him with digging up anything he could use against Marcus and James. The investigator accepted without hesitation, setting into motion a series of events that would escalate the conflict to new heights. Riley, increasingly disillusioned with Barnes, began documenting everything. He kept a detailed record of Barnes' actions and conversations, knowing it could be critical evidence if the investigation moved forward. His nerves were frayed, but his determination to do the right thing kept him focused. Riley's internal struggle mirrored Marcus' own, both young men grappling with the weight of doing what was right in the face of immense pressure. Marcus tried to find moments of normalcy, but the constant attention made it impossible. His friends rallied around him, their support a lifeline in the chaos. Together, they brainstormed ways to keep the momentum going, using social media to amplify their message. Marcus realized the power of his voice and began to embrace his role as an advocate for change, even as the personal toll continued to mount. The private investigator's search led him to a former classmate of Marcus who had a grudge from years ago. The investigator manipulated the classmate into fabricating a story, painting Marcus as a bully. The lie spread quickly, picked up by certain media outlets eager to discredit Marcus. The false accusations hit hard, shaking Marcus' confidence and igniting a new wave of online vitriol. James, furious but composed, mobilized his legal team to counter the false claims. He reached out to the classmate, offering a chance to come clean before the situation escalated further. The classmate, overwhelmed by guilt and pressure, eventually recanted the story, exposing the investigator's tactics. The revelation further tarnished Barnes' credibility, but it also heightened the stakes. Barnes' desperation grew, and his actions became more erratic. At the precinct, the internal investigation gained momentum. Officers were called in for questioning, and Riley's documentation became a key piece of evidence. Barnes realized the walls were closing in on him, but instead of backing down, he doubled his efforts to undermine Marcus and James. His obsession blinded him to the consequences, driving a wedge between him and the few allies he had left. Marcus, despite the setbacks, continued to find strength in the support of his community. He attended rallies and spoke at events, his voice growing louder and more confident with each passing day. The experience transformed him, turning his pain into purpose. He knew the fight wasn't just about him. It was about challenging the system that allowed people like Barnes to operate unchecked. Riley's breaking point came when he overheard Barnes plotting to frame Marcus for a crime he didn't commit. The rookie officer knew he couldn't stay silent any longer. He gathered his notes and evidence, preparing to present them to Internal Affairs. Riley's hands trembled as he made the call, but his voice was steady. He knew the risks, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to do anything less. James received a tip about Barnes' latest scheme and immediately called Marcus to warn him. Marcus, though shaken, refused to be intimidated. He worked with his father and their legal team to prepare for whatever Barnes might throw at them next. The tension reached a boiling point, with both sides bracing for the next move. The final straw came when Barnes' investigator was caught trying to plant false evidence against Marcus. The incident was recorded by a vigilant bystander and quickly went viral. The footage exposed the lengths Barnes was willing to go to destroy Marcus, leaving the police department with no choice but to suspend him pending further investigation. Riley's testimony to Internal Affairs, combined with the mounting evidence, sealed Barnes' fate. The officer was formally charged with misconduct, and the department launched a broader review of its practices. The victory was bittersweet for Marcus and James. While they had cleared Marcus' name and held Barnes accountable, they knew the fight for systemic change was far from over. Marcus stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd of supporters. His voice was strong and unwavering as he spoke about justice, resilience, and the power of community. James watched from the sidelines, pride and hope shining in his eyes. The journey had been arduous, but it had forged an unbreakable bond between father and son, and ignited a movement that would continue to grow. Barnes sat in the dimly lit room, the walls closing in on him as the weight of his suspension bore down. The news of the private investigator's failure had been the final blow. He had miscalculated, and now his every move was under scrutiny. The department's decision to suspend him wasn't just a professional setback, it was a personal humiliation. His mind raced, flipping between anger, denial, and desperation. His reputation, carefully built over decades, was crumbling before his eyes. At the precinct, the air was heavy with unease. The investigation into Barnes' conduct had created an undercurrent of tension among the officers. Some whispered their support for him, clinging to loyalty born of years in the field together. Others distanced themselves, wary of being associated with his actions. Riley, now emboldened by his testimony to Internal Affairs, moved with a newfound purpose. He no longer avoided eye contact with his colleagues, though the unease in their gazes lingered. He had chosen his side, and there was no turning back. Marcus sat at the kitchen table, his hands gripping a cup of coffee. The exhaustion was etched into his face, but his resolve remained intact. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of media appearances, legal battles, and emotional strain. James watched his son quietly, his own thoughts consumed by the growing complexity of their situation. The investigator's exposure had been a victory, but James knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Barnes wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Meanwhile, the private investigator sat in a small interrogation room, his palms sweaty as he faced two internal affairs officers. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as he reluctantly recounted the details of Barnes' instructions. Each word felt like another nail in Barnes' coffin, but the investigator's guilt was tempered by the knowledge that his cooperation might save him from harsher consequences. In the shadows, Barnes plotted his next move. His suspension had cut off his access to department resources, but he still had connections. He reached out to an old friend, a disgraced former officer with a chip on his shoulder. Together, they devised a plan to undermine Marcus and James in a way that would be nearly impossible to trace back to Barnes. It was risky, but Barnes' desperation left him with little choice. Marcus' phone buzzed with a series of messages. Anonymous threats had become a regular occurrence, but this time, the tone was different. The messages contained specific details about his routine, places he frequented, and even a reference to his mother's grave. His stomach churned as he showed the messages to James. The unspoken fear between them grew palpable. James immediately contacted their legal team and law enforcement contacts, demanding increased protection for Marcus. Riley's unease grew as he overheard fragments of conversations among his colleagues. Barnes still had sympathizers within the precinct, officers who resented the scrutiny brought on by the investigation. Riley knew that some of them were quietly aiding Barnes, passing along information or sabotaging efforts to hold him accountable. The rookie officer began documenting these interactions, determined to expose the network of corruption. James coordinated a meeting with community leaders and activists. The goal was clear: keep the momentum going and ensure that the systemic issues brought to light by Marcus' case weren't buried under bureaucratic red tape. The room was charged with energy as voices rose in agreement and determination. Marcus listened intently, feeling both inspired and overwhelmed by the responsibility placed on his shoulders. He knew he couldn't let them down, but the pressure was immense. Barnes' plan moved into action. A fake social media account emerged, posting doctored images and fabricated stories about Marcus and James. The posts were inflammatory, designed to erode their credibility and sow doubt among their supporters. The lies spread quickly, amplified by trolls and bots. Marcus' inbox was flooded with hate, each message chipping away at his composure. James' legal team worked tirelessly to counter the disinformation. They issued statements, contacted platforms to remove the false content, and tracked the source of the posts. Their efforts were met with resistance, the platforms slow to act and the trail of the fake account carefully obscured. James knew Barnes was behind it, but proving it would require more evidence than they currently had. Riley's documentation became increasingly vital. He began working discreetly with an internal affairs officer, sharing his observations and recordings. The weight of his actions felt heavier each day, but he pushed forward, knowing that the truth had to come out. The officer assured him that his efforts were making a difference, but Riley's anxiety about retaliation lingered. Marcus' frustration boiled over during a rally. As he stood before the crowd, his voice wavered with emotion. He spoke passionately about the importance of accountability and justice, but the toll of the constant attacks was evident. His friends and supporters rallied around him, their presence a reminder that he wasn't alone. The crowd's cheers reignited his determination, though the lingering doubt in his mind remained. Barnes and his accomplice celebrated their temporary success. The disinformation campaign had caused enough disruption to slow Marcus and James' progress. But their victory was short-lived. A whistleblower within their circle leaked information to the press, exposing their tactics and linking the fake account to Barnes. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department and the community. James acted swiftly, leveraging the new information to demand immediate action. Internal Affairs escalated their investigation, placing Barnes and his accomplice under closer scrutiny. The pressure on Barnes intensified, and his once loyal allies began to distance themselves, unwilling to be caught in the fallout. Marcus found solace in the growing support from the community. Each rally, each message of encouragement, reminded him of the bigger picture. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was part of a movement that demanded change. The attacks continued, but Marcus' resilience only grew stronger. He channeled his pain and frustration into action, becoming a powerful voice for justice. As Barnes' world crumbled, he made one final desperate attempt to regain control. He confronted Riley in the precinct parking lot, his voice low and threatening. He accused Riley of betrayal, his words dripping with venom. But Riley stood firm, his fear replaced by a newfound confidence. He refused to back down, his resolve unshaken by Barnes' intimidation. The confrontation marked the beginning of the end for Barnes. Internal affairs moved quickly, filing charges against him and his accomplice. The department faced intense public scrutiny, prompting a broader review of its practices. Marcus and James watched as the tide finally turned, their efforts yielding tangible results. In the aftermath, Marcus stood before another crowd, his voice steady and powerful. He spoke of the journey they had endured, the challenges they had overcome, and the work that still lay ahead. James stood beside him, a proud and steadfast presence. The fight wasn't over, but together, they had proven that change was possible. Barnes sat in the dimly lit room of his apartment, the shadows of failure stretching long across his face. His career, his reputation, everything he had spent decades building was now a fragile house of cards ready to collapse. The charges brought against him by internal affairs were the culmination of weeks of missteps and reckless decisions, each one chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. Yet, instead of conceding defeat, Barnes' mind churned with a relentless determination to fight back. He refused to believe this was the end. Across town, Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, the weight of the constant attacks and pressure visible in every line on his face. Yet, there was a resolve in his gaze. The fight had taken more out of him than he ever expected, but it had also shown him his own strength. He stepped out of the bathroom, grabbing his phone, already buzzing with notifications. The messages of support outweighed the hate now, but the darker ones still lingered in his mind, their venomous words impossible to forget. James was in his office, pacing as he reviewed the latest updates from his legal team. The revelations about Barnes' misconduct and the private investigator's involvement had turned public opinion sharply against the officer. But James knew better than to relax. People like Barnes didn't go down without a fight, and he expected retaliation. He called Marcus, his voice steady but filled with concern, reminding him to stay vigilant. At the precinct, Riley's anxiety was palpable as he walked through the hallways. The fallout from his testimony to internal affairs had made him a target among some of his colleagues. The supportive nods from a few were overshadowed by the cold stares and whispered comments of others. Riley's resolve wavered, but he reminded himself why he had spoken out. He wasn't just doing this for Marcus, he was doing it for himself, to prove that the system could be better if people like him stood up. Barnes met with his last remaining ally, a fellow officer named Klein, in the back of a quiet diner. Klein had been vocal in his support of Barnes, even as the evidence mounted against him. They spoke in hushed tones, Barnes outlining a desperate plan to regain control of the narrative. Klein listened intently, nodding along, though even he seemed uneasy about the lengths Barnes was willing to go. Barnes' voice grew more animated as he described his next move, his desperation masked by a facade of confidence. Marcus, meanwhile, attended another rally, the crowd's energy lifting his spirits. He spoke with clarity and passion, his words resonating with those who had gathered to support him. Yet, even as he felt the warmth of their encouragement, he couldn't shake the unease that Barnes was far from finished. The rally ended with chants of solidarity, but Marcus' mind remained restless. Riley spent his evening compiling more evidence. He had started keeping a journal of everything he had witnessed, a meticulous record of Barnes' actions and the corruption within the department. The act of writing gave him a sense of control, a way to channel his fear into something productive. As he closed the journal for the night, Riley felt a small flicker of hope that his efforts might make a difference. Barnes' plan came to fruition late one night. A carefully staged incident, designed to frame Marcus as a violent agitator, was set in motion. Barnes and Klein had recruited a group of provocateurs to cause chaos at a public event where Marcus was scheduled to speak. The plan was simple: create enough confusion and violence to smear Marcus' name, casting doubt on his character and the movement he represented. James received an anonymous tip about the planned disruption just hours before the event. His heart raced as he relayed the information to Marcus and their team. They worked quickly to devise a counter-strategy, enlisting trusted allies to monitor the crowd and document everything. Marcus' nerves were frayed, but he knew he couldn't back down. The event was too important, a symbol of the growing movement for justice. The event began smoothly, with speakers addressing the crowd, their voices echoing with messages of hope and determination. Marcus stepped onto the stage, his heart pounding as he looked out at the sea of faces. He began his speech, his words measured and deliberate, the crowd's energy rising with every sentence. But as he spoke, a commotion broke out near the edge of the crowd. The provocateurs moved quickly, their actions calculated to create maximum chaos. Shouts and scuffles erupted, drawing the attention of the crowd and law enforcement. Marcus paused, his eyes scanning the scene, a sinking feeling in his stomach. James, standing off to the side, immediately recognized the tactics at play. He signaled to their team to start recording, their cameras capturing every detail of the unfolding chaos. Riley, who had been monitoring the event from a distance, saw the disruption and immediately knew Barnes was behind it. He grabbed his phone, documenting what he could while calling internal affairs to report the incident. His hands shook as he described what was happening, his voice filled with urgency. As the chaos grew, Marcus stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. He called for calm, urging the crowd not to give in to the provocation. His words carried a weight that seemed to momentarily still the chaos. The provocateurs, realizing they were being recorded, began to retreat, their actions exposed for what they were. The crowd's unity held firm, and the event continued, though the tension remained. Internal affairs responded swiftly, arriving at the scene to gather evidence. Riley's testimony and the footage collected by Marcus' team provided a clear picture of the orchestrated disruption. The provocateurs were detained, their connections to Barnes and Klein uncovered during questioning. The incident further solidified public support for Marcus and James, while Barnes' remaining credibility crumbled. The next day, Barnes was summoned to a formal hearing. The evidence against him was overwhelming, each piece a nail in the coffin of his career. As he sat in the sterile hearing room, the weight of his actions finally seemed to register. His once defiant demeanor gave way to a sullen silence as the charges were read aloud. Klein, facing his own consequences, refused to look at Barnes, their alliance shattered under the pressure. Marcus stood outside the hearing room, surrounded by supporters and media. He felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion as the news of Barnes' downfall spread. James placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his expression one of quiet pride. The fight had taken its toll, but they had emerged stronger, their bond unbreakable. Riley, watching from the sidelines, felt a sense of vindication. He had faced his fears and done what was right, and the outcome gave him hope for the future. The rookie officer's journey was far from over, but he felt a renewed determination to continue challenging the system from within. As the sun set on the day's events, Marcus and James reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The road ahead remained uncertain, but they were ready to face it together, knowing they had already overcome so much. The movement they had ignited continued to grow, a beacon of hope and resilience in the face of adversity. Barnes paced the small confines of his apartment, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of anger, humiliation, and desperation. The fallout from the hearing had been catastrophic. Stripped of his badge and facing public disgrace, he found himself cornered, his mind racing for a way to regain control. The world outside felt hostile, with the media's unrelenting focus on his actions and the department distancing itself from his name. But Barnes was not the type to surrender quietly. He clenched his fists, his jaw tight as he resolved to fight back by any means necessary. At the same time, Marcus sat with James at their dining table, their faces etched with exhaustion but tinged with determination. The day's events had been a whirlwind of interviews, meetings, and rallies. Marcus' resolve had only deepened with every passing challenge, but the weight of the fight bore heavily on him. James watched his son closely, sensing the cracks beneath the surface. He reminded Marcus that resilience didn't mean carrying the burden alone and urged him to lean on the people who supported him. Riley's unease lingered as he walked through the precinct's hallways. Though Barnes was gone, the remnants of his influence still festered. Riley overheard muttered conversations from officers who sympathized with Barnes, their bitterness aimed at Marcus and the growing movement for accountability. The young officer's grip on his notebook tightened as he committed to documenting every detail. He knew the fight wasn't over and that the systemic issues Barnes represented ran deep. Riley's determination to expose the truth burned brighter with every passing day. Barnes reached out to a shadowy contact, a figure he had relied on in the past for delicate matters. The man, known only as Cole, was a fixer who operated outside the bounds of legality. Barnes laid out his plan, his voice steady but filled with venom. He wanted to discredit Marcus and James completely, to ruin their lives in a way that no public support could repair. Cole listened impassively, his calculating mind already formulating a strategy. He assured Barnes that he would handle everything, his tone cold and professional. Marcus, unaware of the storm brewing against him, tried to focus on the positive. He attended a community meeting that evening, surrounded by supporters who expressed their gratitude and admiration for his courage. Their words lifted his spirits, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. His instincts had been honed by weeks of relentless attacks, and he knew better than to let his guard down completely. As the meeting ended, Marcus lingered to speak with a young activist who shared her story of facing police harassment. Her words resonated deeply, reinforcing his commitment to the fight for justice. James, meanwhile, was in his office, poring over case files and preparing for the next legal battle. The attacks on Marcus had only strengthened his resolve, but he knew their opponents were relentless. His phone buzzed with a call from an anonymous number. Hesitant, he answered, and a distorted voice delivered a cryptic warning: "Back off or the consequences will be worse than you can imagine." James' grip on the phone tightened, his mind racing as he tried to place the voice. He immediately contacted his security team, instructing them to increase precautions around Marcus and their home. Cole began his operation with precision, digging into every aspect of Marcus and James' lives. He planted false evidence and manipulated digital records to create a narrative that painted Marcus as a fraud and James as corrupt. The fabricated information was carefully leaked to sympathetic media outlets, sparking a new wave of controversy. The headlines were damning, filled with accusations that undermined everything Marcus and James had fought to build. Marcus awoke to a flood of notifications on his phone, his heart sinking as he read the headlines. The lies were so elaborate, so detailed, that even some of his supporters began to waver. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his chest, but he refused to let it consume him. Marcus called James, his voice filled with urgency as they discussed their next steps. James reassured his son, promising that they would uncover the truth and expose whoever was behind the attack. Riley, catching wind of the latest smear campaign, felt a surge of anger. He knew it had Barnes' fingerprints all over it, even if the former officer wasn't directly implicated. Riley shared his suspicions with Internal Affairs, providing them with the evidence he had collected over the weeks. The investigator assigned to the case commended Riley for his bravery, but warned him to stay vigilant. The young officer nodded, knowing the risks but unwilling to back down. James' legal team worked tirelessly to counter the fabricated evidence. They traced the leaks to Cole, uncovering a trail of payments and communications that linked him back to Barnes. The discovery was a breakthrough, but it also painted a target on their backs. James ensured that every piece of evidence was secured and prepared to go public with their findings. He knew the backlash would be fierce, but the truth had to come out. As Marcus prepared for another public appearance, he couldn't ignore the fear gnawing at him. The lies had taken a toll, but the support of his friends and community gave him strength. He stepped onto the stage, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. He spoke of resilience, truth, and the power of unity in the face of adversity. The crowd's response was overwhelming, their cheers echoing in his ears as he finished his speech. Cole, watching the speech from a distance, realized that his efforts hadn't broken Marcus as Barnes had hoped. He called Barnes, his tone measured as he informed him that their operation had failed to achieve its intended effect. Barnes' frustration boiled over, his voice rising as he demanded results. Cole, ever pragmatic, warned Barnes that pushing further would only lead to greater exposure and consequences. The tipping point came when James' legal team released their findings to the media. The evidence linking Cole to Barnes was irrefutable, and the public backlash was swift and unforgiving. Barnes' remaining allies abandoned him, unwilling to be dragged down with him. Cole disappeared into the shadows, his reputation tarnished but his anonymity intact. Marcus and James watched the fallout with a mix of relief and exhaustion. The battle had been grueling, but they had emerged stronger. Marcus addressed his supporters once more, his voice filled with gratitude and determination. He spoke of the lessons he had learned and the importance of continuing the fight for justice. The crowd's applause was deafening, a testament to the strength of their shared resolve. Riley, reflecting on his journey, felt a sense of pride in his actions. He had faced his fears and stood up for what was right, proving to himself and others that change was possible. As he left the precinct that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue the fight from within. Barnes, now completely isolated, sat alone in his apartment, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. The walls around him felt suffocating, his once unshakable confidence replaced by regret and bitterness. He realized too late that his obsession had destroyed everything he had worked for, leaving him with nothing but the echoes of his own downfall. Marcus and James, though weary, looked to the future with hope. They knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready to face it together. Their journey had shown them the power of resilience, truth, and community, and they vowed to continue fighting for a better world. The aftermath of Cole's exposure sent ripples through every corner of the movement. Marcus sat quietly in the living room, surrounded by his closest friends and allies. His thoughts churned with both relief and apprehension. The public had rallied behind him after the latest revelations, but the relentless nature of the fight had worn him down. Every step forward seemed to come with an equal measure of resistance. He glanced at James, who was busy on a call, his voice steady and commanding. Marcus drew strength from his father's resilience, even as doubt lingered in his mind. Riley, seated in the Internal Affairs office, handed over another file of evidence. His journey from silent observer to active whistleblower had been fraught with danger, but he felt a deep satisfaction with each piece of information he revealed. The investigator in front of him nodded approvingly, noting the connections Riley had uncovered between Barnes and several other corrupt officers. Riley's work was turning the tide, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his own position in the precinct was becoming increasingly precarious. Barnes, now a shadow of his former self, sat across from his lawyer in a sterile office. The man in front of him spoke in measured tones, outlining the dwindling options available. Every avenue Barnes had pursued had backfired spectacularly, leaving him with few allies and even fewer resources. His frustration boiled over as he slammed his fist on the table, his voice rising in defiance. He refused to believe this was the end, his mind grasping for a way to turn the situation in his favor. The lawyer remained stoic, cautioning Barnes to tread carefully. But Barnes' pride and anger were far from subdued. Marcus' phone buzzed with notifications. A new round of threats had emerged, some veiled, others explicit. The messages were a bitter reminder of the deeply rooted hatred he was fighting against. He shared the information with James, who immediately contacted law enforcement to bolster their security. The stress was palpable, but Marcus refused to let fear dictate his actions. He knew the stakes were high, not just for him but for everyone who looked to him as a symbol of resistance. James convened a meeting with key members of their legal and advocacy team. The discussion was tense but focused, centering on the next steps to dismantle the systemic issues Barnes and his network represented. They pored over documents, strategizing how to bring more corrupt officers to justice while maintaining public momentum. James' voice carried authority, his words precise as he outlined their plan. Marcus watched from the corner, absorbing the gravity of their mission. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, even as the weight of expectation pressed heavily on his shoulders. Riley's unease grew as whispers about his actions circulated through the precinct. Some colleagues avoided him, their gazes cold and distant. Others openly criticized him, accusing him of betraying the Brotherhood. Riley's determination faltered momentarily, but the thought of Marcus and James kept him grounded. He reminded himself that his work was making a difference, even if it came at a personal cost. Barnes, refusing to accept defeat, reached out to one of his remaining contacts, a journalist with a reputation for sensationalism. He offered an exclusive interview, framing himself as a victim of political persecution. The journalist, sensing an opportunity for a headline-grabbing story, agreed. Barnes' words dripped with calculated manipulation as he painted a picture of a system corrupted not by him but by those seeking to dismantle law enforcement. The interview aired within days, sparking a brief but intense wave of division among the public. Marcus watched the interview with a mix of anger and frustration. Barnes' lies were transparent to him, but he knew they would resonate with a certain segment of the population. James reassured him, emphasizing the importance of staying focused on their goals. They couldn't afford to be distracted by Barnes' last-ditch efforts. Instead, they doubled down on their outreach, connecting with communities to highlight the importance of accountability and reform. Riley's role became even more critical as Internal Affairs intensified their investigation. He provided key testimony, linking Barnes' actions to a broader network of corruption within the department. The tension in his voice was evident as he recounted what he had witnessed, but his resolve never wavered. The investigators commended Riley for his courage, promising that his efforts would lead to meaningful change. Riley's heart swelled with a mix of pride and anxiety, knowing the risks he faced were far from over. The public's response to Barnes' interview was mixed, but the momentum of the movement Marcus and James had built proved stronger. Community leaders and activists rallied together, countering Barnes' narrative with facts and stories of lived experience. The rallies grew larger, the chants louder, as people from all walks of life united in their demand for justice. Marcus found himself at the center of it all, his voice growing stronger with each speech he gave. Barnes' attempts to regain control continued to falter. His remaining allies distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his increasingly erratic behavior. The journalist who had interviewed him published a follow-up article, revealing inconsistencies in Barnes' claims. The tide had fully turned, leaving Barnes isolated and desperate. He lashed out, his anger consuming him as he realized the extent of his downfall. Marcus, feeling the strain of the constant battles, took a rare moment to reflect. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the challenges he had faced, and the people who had stood by him. His friends, his father, and even Riley had become pillars of support in a fight that often felt insurmountable. Marcus' determination solidified as he resolved to see the struggle through, no matter the cost. James received word that the case against Barnes was nearing its conclusion. The evidence Riley and others had provided was damning, leaving little room for doubt about Barnes' guilt. The district attorney prepared to make a public announcement, outlining the charges and emphasizing the need for systemic reform. James knew the importance of this moment, not just for Marcus, but for the broader fight against injustice. Riley, despite the progress made, continued to face hostility within the precinct. He found solace in the small acts of kindness from a few supportive colleagues, but the tension was unrelenting. His decision to stand up had come at a personal cost, but Riley knew it was worth it. He reminded himself that change was never easy, and the sacrifices he made were part of something much larger than himself. The day of the announcement arrived, and Marcus stood with James on the steps of the courthouse. The crowd before them was a sea of faces, their energy palpable. James spoke first, his voice steady as he outlined the charges against Barnes and the steps being taken to address corruption within the department. The crowd erupted in applause, their faith in justice momentarily restored. When Marcus took the microphone, his voice carried a mix of gratitude and determination. He spoke of the importance of resilience, unity, and the power of community. His words resonated deeply, drawing cheers and chants from the crowd. Marcus felt a surge of hope, knowing that their fight was far from over, but that they had made undeniable progress. Barnes watched the announcement from his apartment, his face a mask of bitterness. He knew his time was up, his attempts to salvage his reputation having failed spectacularly. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him hollow and defeated. For the first time, Barnes truly understood the magnitude of his actions and the consequences they had wrought. Marcus and James, though weary, felt a sense of accomplishment as they left the courthouse. They had faced relentless opposition, but their efforts had brought about real change. As they walked away, the chants of the crowd echoed behind them, a reminder that the fight for justice was never truly over. They had won a significant battle, but the journey to dismantle systemic injustice continued, and they were ready to face whatever came next. Marcus stood on the stage, his heart pounding as the sea of faces before him roared with applause. This rally was the largest yet, a testament to how far the movement had come. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he began to speak, recounting the journey that had led them here. The fight for justice had transformed him, and he wanted to remind everyone that their collective power had made it possible. But even as he spoke, a lingering unease settled in his chest. He knew the battle wasn't over. James watched his son with pride, though his expression betrayed the exhaustion etched into his features. The past weeks had been a relentless push to keep the momentum alive, navigating legal battles, media appearances, and threats that never seemed to cease. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a notification from their legal team. He excused himself from the crowd to take the call, his voice dropping as he listened intently. The news was unexpected. New evidence had emerged implicating not just Barnes but a broader network within the precinct. The revelation was both a breakthrough and a warning of the challenges yet to come. At the precinct, Riley walked through the hallways with a mixture of unease and determination. The fallout from Barnes' case had left a palpable tension in the air. Officers who had once ignored him now regarded him with open hostility, their resentment clear. Riley held his head high, refusing to let their disdain deter him. He knew the importance of his work and the risks that came with it. His resolve was tested further when a senior officer approached him, warning him to back off. Riley's hands clenched, but he kept his response measured, promising himself he wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. Meanwhile, Barnes was holed up in a dingy motel room, his face pale and drawn. The latest revelations had decimated any remaining semblance of his reputation, and he was running out of options. His lawyer had abandoned him, and his former allies had distanced themselves. He stared at the television, watching the rally as Marcus' words filled the screen. Barnes' bitterness festered, fueling a dangerous desperation. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end answered curtly, and Barnes laid out his final plan, his tone trembling with anger and fear. Marcus ended his speech to thunderous applause, stepping off the stage as his friends and supporters surrounded him. The energy was electric, but Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing. He glanced at James, who had just returned from his call, his expression unreadable. James pulled Marcus aside, sharing the news about the expanded investigation. Marcus' jaw tightened as he processed the implications. Their fight had exposed more than they had anticipated, and the stakes were higher than ever. Cole, the fixer who had once worked for Barnes, sat in a dimly lit room with a laptop in front of him. His reputation was in shambles, but he hadn't disappeared entirely. He had been watching from the shadows, tracking the developments with a mix of fascination and caution. The latest revelations threatened to implicate him further, and he knew he needed to act fast to protect himself. He began erasing files, covering his tracks as best he could. But he wasn't just running, he was also planning his next move, one that could shift the narrative back in his favor. Riley's phone buzzed with a message from the internal affairs investigator he had been working with. The investigator requested an urgent meeting, citing critical developments in the case. Riley felt a knot form in his stomach as he read the message. He agreed to meet, his mind racing with possibilities. As he left the precinct, he noticed two officers watching him closely, their expressions cold and unyielding. Riley's grip on his bag tightened, his steps quickening as he exited the building. Marcus and James returned home, their conversation heavy with the weight of the day's events. Marcus expressed his frustration, feeling like every victory was met with an even greater challenge. James reminded him that this was the nature of systemic change, that progress was never linear. Their exchange was interrupted by a knock at the door. James answered cautiously, finding a young woman standing there, her face pale but determined. She introduced herself as a whistleblower from the precinct, someone who had worked closely with Barnes and had information that could change everything. The woman's testimony was explosive. She detailed a network of officers who had colluded to protect Barnes and others like him, engaging in cover-ups, falsifying reports, and intimidating witnesses. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her resolve was clear. Marcus and James listened intently, their determination hardening with each revelation. They promised to protect her, knowing the risks she faced by coming forward. Riley's meeting with Internal Affairs took place in a secluded office. The investigator laid out the new evidence, connecting the dots between Barnes, Cole, and the broader network within the department. Riley's heart sank as he realized the extent of the corruption. He felt a mix of anger and fear, knowing the danger this information posed to those seeking to expose it. The investigator assured him that every precaution was being taken, but Riley couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Barnes' final plan unfolded that night. He had enlisted a small group of loyalists, officers who still believed in him despite the overwhelming evidence against him. They targeted Marcus directly, seeking to discredit him in a way that couldn't be undone. Their actions were reckless, but Barnes' desperation blinded him to the consequences. The plan was set in motion, but its execution faltered as one of the loyalists hesitated, their conscience wavering in the face of what they were about to do. Marcus received a call from Riley, who warned him about the imminent threat. Riley's voice was urgent, his words spilling out as he relayed what he had learned. Marcus' pulse quickened as he processed the information, his mind racing with how to respond. He contacted James, who immediately activated their security measures. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude for Riley, whose bravery had likely saved him from walking into a trap. The confrontation came to a head in a public square, where Barnes and his loyalists attempted to corner Marcus during a scheduled event. But Marcus wasn't alone. Riley had tipped off Internal Affairs, who arrived on the scene with overwhelming evidence and support. The loyalists faltered, their resolve breaking under the weight of the truth. Barnes, realizing he was outmatched, lashed out one final time, his words filled with venom and denial. But his actions only solidified his downfall, as the crowd watched him be taken into custody. Marcus stood amidst the chaos, his heart pounding as he absorbed what had just happened. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a mix of relief and triumph. James approached his son, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. Marcus looked at his father, their shared resolve unspoken but deeply felt. They had faced the storm together and emerged stronger. Riley watched from the sidelines, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and relief. He had risked everything to do what was right, and now, he saw the tangible results of his actions. The young officer knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt hope that real change was possible. Barnes sat in a holding cell, his head in his hands as the reality of his situation finally sank in. His pride, his arrogance, and his refusal to change had led him to this moment. The walls around him felt suffocating, a stark contrast to the power he had once wielded. He was alone, left to face the consequences of his actions. Marcus and James stood together on the steps of City Hall the next day, addressing a crowd that had gathered to celebrate the victory. Marcus spoke of the power of resilience, unity, and the importance of continuing the fight for justice. James echoed his son's sentiments, emphasizing that their journey had only just begun. The crowd's cheers echoed through the streets, a testament to the strength of their movement. As the sun set on the day's events, Marcus reflected on how far they had come. The fight had been grueling, but it had forged unbreakable bonds and ignited a movement that would continue to grow. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it with the same determination that had brought them to this moment. Together, they had proven that change was possible, and their story was far from over.